Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Falls. I'm the Chief of Researcher Engagement here at the Library of Virginia in Richmond, Virginia. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are pleased to welcome historian Dr. Robert Colby, who will be discussing his first book, An Unholy Traffic, Slave Trading in the Civil War South. The book examines how Confederates bought and sold thousands of men, women, and children through a persisting trade in enslaved people. They did so for a multitude of reasons, including adaptation to conflict, investment in their desired slaveholding future, and to fend off the onset of emancipation. The surviving traffic in humanity thus shaped the experience of the Civil War and its aftermath for all inhabitants of the wartime South. Dr. Robert Colby is an assistant professor of history at the University of Mississippi. His research has won awards from the Society of American Historians and the Society of Civil War Historians, and has been published in the Journal of the Civil War Era, Journal of the Early Republic, and Slavery and Abolition.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah. And good afternoon to everybody. I'm really delighted to be with you all today. Thank you to Sarah and to Anne and to Ashley for setting this event up, and to the Library of Virginia for hosting me. It's a real pleasure to get to speak virtually to you all through the library, especially given it was one of the first places I ever did historical research nearly 20 years ago. So it's a particular pleasure to share my work with this audience. It also seems appropriate to begin our conversation today with a story that I found working through the library's resources. And to do that, we're gonna take ourselves to the spring of 1864. That spring, a woman named Candace and her unnamed child joined a large group of people from Greensville County, Virginia. The upper left arrow on the map above or on the screen. They joined a large group of people from that county in fleeing their enslavement. Candace and her child, along with a man named Lewis, specifically fled enslavement by a recently widowed woman named Dorothy Flive. And they were bound when they fled for one of the refugee camps that had sprung up around United States Army posts in North Carolina. We don't know exactly which one they fled to. New Bern, down on the coast, would have been the largest, but Plymouth, denoted by the lower green arrow on this map, was by far the closest. About 1,000 fugitives from slavery had congregated in Plymouth by that spring, and it was the closest. Though even Plymouth was at least 90 miles away from their point of departure. Whichever their destination, we know that Candace, her child, and Lewis made it to Union lines, to the lines of what their enslaver would later call the public enemy, the Union Army. And in doing so, they became three of the hundreds of thousands of people who fled for refuge in Union lines during the Civil War. Thus far, I would guess that this story resonates with anyone familiar with the Civil War. If we know anything about the Civil War, we generally know that emancipation is a core part of it. But the subsequent story of Candace and Lewis and Candace's child reveals a darker side of that conflict and an aspect of it that's seldom told. The details are pretty fuzzy, but somehow we know that the Flives recaptured Candace and Lewis and extracted them from Union lines. This may indicate that they'd taken refuge at Plymouth because a Confederate force overran that camp and the Union forces stationed around it in mid-April 1864. And when it did so, while many of the African Americans who'd taken refuge in Plymouth fled, we know that Confederates recaptured many more and killed still others in cold blood. If Candace and Lewis were indeed at Plymouth, it would explain one of the many tragic aspects of this event that we know about. Because we know that in retaking the fugitives, Confederates, and this is how the Flives later put it in court documents, accidentally killed Candace's child. The fall of Plymouth was a bloody event. Shot and shell were flying everywhere. So this may well be true, or it may mask a sort of darker narrative. What is certain, what we know, to get back to what we know for sure, is that the rebels returned Candace and Lewis to the Flythes, who in turn believed that it would be, as they put it in a court document, unsafe to attempt to retain them in Greensville County, given that the county was so near the enemy's lines, where, again, as the Flythes put it, they would again make their escape on the first opportunity that presented itself. So what was their solution? Well, the solution the Flythes came in the form of Richmond's slave market. This building is now under where I-95 passes through the city. These are the auction rooms of Dickinson Hill and Company, one of the major slave trading firms operated in Richmond. And I don't know if Dickinson Hill and Company specifically sold Candace. But we know that by June 1864, Candace had indeed been sold in Richmond to a man named William Doyle for $4,500. And you can see that depicted on this court document. Excuse me, my apologies. At some level, there's nothing particularly remarkable about the fact that the Flythes sold Candace. Tragic though it was, and particularly in the fact that the death of her child was tied up within it. But to put it bluntly, the antebellum South had been built upon millions of such transactions, the untold numbers of moments in which slaveholders bought, sold, or moved a person within the region. What's remarkable to me about this is when this transaction took place. We know that it took place in May or June 1864, fully 3 years into a civil war that had wreaked havoc on the southern states. It is an understatement, and I would say it is an understatement to say that significant obstacles stood in the way of the Flythes' efforts to dispose of Candace. While Candace awaited her fate, for example, Ulysses S. Grant launched the Overland Campaign, and the Army of the Potomac ground toward Richmond. By June, that army would have stood between Greensville County and the rebel capital. And that summer and fall, Union expeditions would make their way towards Greensville itself. There were economic obstacles as well. Inflation, particularly, which had averaged 10% per month in the first 3 years of the war, had begun to accelerate to, if that's not catastrophic proportions already, had begun to accelerate even further. Laws passed by the Confederate Congress to rein it in that spring had backfired, and as a result had brought business of all types, including slave trading, to a standstill earlier that spring. And of course, as Candace and Lewis's flight showed all too clearly, emancipation was fully on the table by the spring of 1864 and had become an avowed war aim of the United States. That the Flythes would want to sell Candace, therefore, might not be all that surprising. But what is surprising, and in some ways is the factor that led me to try to write this book, is the fact that despite all of the problems, all of the challenges that we just discussed, they were able to find a buyer for her as late as the spring of 1864. Now, I would say this sequence of events illuminates an often overlooked part of the Civil War, one that few historians have ever really discussed. But buried within Civil War letters and diaries, newspapers, military records, court documents, and the narratives left by people enslaved in the United States are traces of a massive commerce in humanity that white Southerners carried on during the Civil War. Though we'll never know the precise number, what is certain is that between Fort Sumter and Appomattox, Confederates bought and sold thousands of people. And that trade played a profound role in how Southerners, white and black, experienced the Civil War. What I'd like to discuss tonight in more detail is why, in the face of all the challenges raised by the Civil War, the slave trade survived, and to get more intimately into what its persistence meant for the inhabitants of the wartime South. Before we do that, I would like to just briefly outline for a minute what we're talking about when we talk about the domestic slave trade and slave trading. Richmond has been thinking, I know Richmonders, I know many folks in the audience are from the Richmond area. This is something Richmond has sort of been grappling with more and more, its own history of slave trading. But a brief overview, I think, would be useful. In essence, what we talk about when we talk about the domestic slave trade is the purchase, sale, and forced movement of people within the United States, as distinct from the movement of enslaved people across the Atlantic Ocean as part of the larger Atlantic slave trade. Um, by the time the Civil War broke out in 1861, the United States' internal slave trade was roughly a century old and was a flourishing business. It had really boomed in the half century, the decades immediately preceding the Civil War, particularly after 1808, when Congress closed, or Congress, following a provision in the Constitution, banned Americans from participating in the Atlantic slave trade, which meant that if American slaveholders were going to acquire or to sell people, they had to do it within the United States. And as a result, a robust trade in enslaved people sprang up in the American South. All told, we know that between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, we know that white Southerners and predominantly a group of professional slave traders moved between 6 and 800,000 people through long distance slave sales. That is to say, they sold between 6 and 800,000 people from upper South states like Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, Kentucky, Missouri, and moved those people to wherever happened to be the leading edge of the cotton or sugar frontiers at that moment, whether that's Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and later in the 19th century, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas. Um, this trade accumulated people in cities like Alexandria or Richmond or Norfolk, as well as St. Louis or Lexington or Louisville, Kentucky, and moved them. Slave traders moved people from those places either overland to places like Natchez, Mississippi, or by water to Mobile, New Orleans, and later Houston, Galveston, and ports in Texas. The human property moved through the slave trade brought considerable wealth to those who accrued it. And this came not just through cash crops that they grew, though cotton is the leading American commodity in the 19th century, but also through the fact that the existence of the slave trade means that an enslaved person can always be bought or sold, which means that that person always bears sort of imprinted upon them a price, a concrete monetary value that slaveholders could translate into credit, mortgages, and securities, which in many cases then circulated widely in American and Atlantic finance. Uh, this cannot really be understated. By the time the Civil War began, the value slaveholders attributed to enslaved people, which again is rooted in the ability to buy and sell those people at any time. By the time the Civil War began, the collective price enslaved people bore made them the second most valuable form of property in the United States. Enslaved people were worth more than all the capital in the nation's banks. They were worth more than all of the money invested in railroads. They were worth more than everything bought or sold on Wall Street. The only thing worth more than people enslaved in the United States in 1860 was land. The American slave market, in short, made slave trading a big business. Now, despite all of this, for reasons that we've already sort of begun to discuss, the Civil War would seem to be an inauspicious time to be trading in enslaved people. Haven't explicitly mentioned this yet. I'll say it now. The onset of the war absolutely wrecks the cotton economy, which had been the primary driver of the purchase and sale of enslaved people. In the first year of the Civil War, for example, the amount of cotton exported from New Orleans, the leading port of the Cotton South, dropped by 98%. We've already noted also that inflation undercut people's ability to engage in economic transactions of any kind. And of course, the persistent flight of enslaved people, as depicted here, taking place at Fortress Monroe down on the Virginia Peninsula. You can actually walk through this gate if you visit Fort Monroe. You have to watch out for traffic a little bit, but it's a powerful spot to visit given images like this. Persistent flight by enslaved people, combined with expanding United States policies, from the Confiscation Acts to the Emancipation Proclamation, again made Black freedom sort of inextricably bound up with the Civil War. which as a result imperiled not just the slave trade, but the institution of slavery writ large. And yet, Confederates continued to engage in the slave trade until the war's last days. Through its continuance, I argue they shaped their experiences of the war. They relied on it, their ability to deal in laborers, to mobilize for the conflict, to weather the crises it created, to offset the advance of emancipation, and as Sarah suggested, and I think this was one of the things that struck me the most as I was doing this research, to try to construct the slaveholding future for which they fought the war. For enslaved people, meanwhile, the persisting trade in slaves dramatically shaped the ways in which they could pursue freedom. Again, Candace's story illustrates this so powerfully, and drawing many into what I call a retrograde movement of slave commerce, a movement away from freedom. Even as the threat of sale inspired others to seize that risky freedom. Regardless of which choice they made, I would argue the effects of the wartime slave trade reverberated in the lives, particularly of Black Southerners, long after the guns fell silent. Now, I want to say a little bit on the overall trajectory of the domestic slave trade during the Civil War before we talk about these reasons in a bit more detail. Because to the degree that historians have previously examined the wartime slave trade, they've assumed that it disappeared pretty quickly. There is a measure of truth to that, but it really depends on when and where you look. As a general rule, it is fair to say that wherever United States forces held sway, the slave trade diminished considerably. And this happened for a very straightforward reason. Wherever there were U.S. soldiers or sailors, the combined weight of enslaved people's efforts to pursue their freedom, as well as the Union soldiers and officers abetting these efforts, and the evolving policies of the U.S. government undermined white Southerners' confidence in their ability to keep and thereby to profit from human property. This generally made slaveholders in regions occupied by or adjacent to U.S. forces unwilling to speculate in particularly the purchase of enslaved people. Enslaved property was simply too risky an investment to sustain a market in it. Now, there are, of course, exceptions, even in Union occupied territory. The slide I have up right now depicts a slave auction from Kentucky. And in slaveholding border states like Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, for example, slave transactions continued during the Civil War. Indeed, they had to continue because slavery was a legal institution for virtually the entirety of the Civil War. This traffic could attain a pretty significant scale. One Union commander stationed in the region estimated that slave holders had sold thousands of people between Missouri and Kentucky alone during the Civil War. Marylanders, meanwhile, kept tabs on slave markets in Virginia, and as opportunities presented themselves, moved people across the Potomac. Even in parts of the Confederacy occupied by Union forces, the freedom is pretty precarious. Some Union regiments even become infamous for kidnapping and selling enslaved people back to Confederates across the Union lines. The 99th New York, stationed in and around Norfolk, particularly is notorious for doing this. But generally speaking, there's an unmistakable trend that essentially we can say this, where United States forces held sway, the slave trade dries up. What this means is that in the first calendar year of the Civil War, major slave markets, major antebellum slave markets in places like Alexandria, Norfolk, Memphis, and most importantly, New Orleans, which had been the largest slave market in the United States, these all but disappear from the map, erasing what had been some of the nation's largest slave markets. That said, much of the Confederacy remains outside of Union control for most of the war. We're talking about Virginia, south of Richmond, most of North and South Carolina, most of Georgia and Alabama, parts of Mississippi and Louisiana, and virtually all of Texas and Florida. And in these places, the domestic slave trade survived and even thrived as slaveholders remade the slave trade to fit their needs and speculated in opportunities the war provided. Excuse me. In Texas, for example, the state's enslaved population boomed during the war as slaveholders fled in massive numbers from the Union-occupied Mississippi River Valley. When these men and women got to Texas, they often found that they could not feed or supply or employ the enslaved men and women they had brought with them. As a result, in many cases, slaveholders from Arkansas, Missouri, Mississippi, and Louisiana sold people in Texas. And Texan buyers took advantage of this, scooping up enslaved people at what they considered to be bargain prices. Um, the same process took place in miniature in Virginia or the Carolinas or Georgia, where Union occupations on the coast drove slaveholders and enslaved people inland, and where slaveholders generally often took advantage of markets in the interior, hoping to get something for the people they enslaved rather than risk losing them entirely. Thus, you find, for example, in like October 1862, a Confederate war clerk working in Richmond reported that virtually every train car that arrived in the city was packed with African Americans sent there for sale from either the peninsula or the Tidewater or Northern Virginia. One can then, I think, imagine reasons why Confederates might want to sell people during the war. The more perplexing question, I think, from our standpoint is why, and this gets to the question I raised at the beginning, right? Why are the Flides, for example, able to find someone to buy someone like Candace during the war? Um, and while there are incredibly varied reasons for this, the reasons vary as much as the personalities at stake and as well as the circumstances the war created for people, I want to focus on three main motivations behind the survival of the slave trade in the Confederacy. I want to suggest that the slave market helped Confederates navigate wartime crises, fend off emancipation, and lay an economic foundation for their future. I want to start by talking about the needs the war creates. For one, and I'm going to give just examples here, we could talk about hundreds of different moments that all sort of reflect this reality in one way or another. But just as an example, one of the things the Confederacy has to do during the Civil War is mobilize to fight a modern war. The Confederacy had been a primarily agricultural region. Fighting a war like the Civil War requires huge amounts of weapons, ammunition, supplies, uniforms, all of that. Uh, Complicating this is the fact that fairly quickly, almost all of the military aged white men in the Confederacy are in the Army at one point. By the war's end, 80% of the military aged men in the Confederacy will have served in the military. As a result, all this work that has to be done, all of these businesses, all of these industries that have to be stood up, the work for doing that falls very, very heavily on enslaved people. Um, this is again isn't necessarily new, not at least not in practice, but it is in scale. Southern industrial firms had always rented enslaved people to do the work required of them, but the competition is intense, especially as the Civil War advances. If you all are familiar with, for example, the American Civil War Museum, housed in the old Tredegar Ironworks. Before the Civil War, Tredegar had employed about 40 to 50 enslaved people in a given year working there in various capacities. By 1864, there are close to 800 enslaved people working at Tredegar. And while Tredegar rented most of those people from slaveholders, they also turned to the slave market to acquire enslaved laborers that they needed. If we're talking about documents that I found at the Library of Virginia, a bunch of those are in Tredegar's papers. A good example, in October 1862, the Tredegar Ironworks bought a man named John. John was a blacksmith, something really critical to the operations at Tredegar. And what I think is really telling about this moment is in this transaction, they don't just buy John, but they also buy his family. Which I think speaks to the reasons why Tredegar would turn to the slave market. They are worried about competition for John's labor. John is a skilled laborer. They also want to make sure that John is going to be, and I'm going to use scare quotes here, relatively happy working at Tredegar. And so rather than risk, for example, him fleeing this critical work done for the Confederate government, they acquire his family to presumably provide an incentive for him to work. You see similar things happening all over the Confederacy. In the Shenandoah Valley, slaveholders buy enslaved laborers to work iron forges. Down in Midlothian, the coal mines buy people to work in the coal mines. Slaveholders really hate renting people to coal mines. Railroads spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on enslaved people during the Civil War. Um, so what I want to suggest is the upheaval of the war, including the need to mobilize to fight this conflict, drove both individual enslavers and large industrial firms to the slave market to secure essential labor. You see the same thing happening with individual Confederates as they navigate the smaller scale crises, but still, deeply difficult crises that the war creates. So, for example, as the war grinds on and as Confederate infrastructure deteriorates, you see pretty significant food shortages in large parts of the Confederacy. As a means of responding to this, many Confederates sell people who they believe they can no longer feed and take the money raised through those sales to acquire food to support the rest. As one South Carolinian put it, her neighbors were selling people, and this is a direct quote, all the time to furnish support for the rest. There was a flip side to this, however. Another South Carolinian supposedly bought more than 100 people during the Civil War, whom he put to work raising food that he could then sell in overcrowded cities like Charleston and Savannah, making money sort of doubly off of the slave trade. The other ways in which the white Southerners and Confederates particularly used the slave trade to adapt are too numerous to go into detail. But I'll give you one. I'll give you one more major example. As Confederate money plummeted in value, thanks to example, some Confederates traded enslaved people to anyone who they thought might be willing to take their place in the army. Confederate conscription laws, at least early in the war, had a loophole where if you were drafted into the Confederate service, but you could find someone willing to serve in your place, you could escape service. Well, that requires a pretty significant investment. As the war goes on, most Confederates are not willing to take Confederate money for this. And so, what many slaveholders offer up is enslaved people as a way of avoiding military service. The document on the screen in front of you is a contract from Rusk County, Texas, where a slaveholder traded a girl named Charlotte to avoid Confederate military service. Um, the Civil War also, and I will say that I was stunned by the number of moments where I found people doing this. This is a very common practice in the Confederacy. I will also say that the Civil War reorients Confederate households. Again, 80% of the military-aged men will be in the military by the war's end. And as a result, that increases the burdens that fall on slaveholding women. They respond to these burdens in many cases by turning to the slave market, whether to find someone to clean or to cook or to work in the fields for them, or to maintain discipline on laborers who they feel do not respect them or are not responsive. So Confederate women turn in large numbers to the slave market. Other people see this as an opportunity to advance in the world, to raise their status. As one Texan argued, he's trying to convince his wife that they should buy an enslaved person. Buying a slave could, quote, keep my darling daughter out of the kitchen and enable her the better to pursue with assiduity her studies and the accomplishment of her mind. Acquiring enslaved people would be a way of raising their social status. So, in short, the Civil War creates incredibly wide ranging reasons and sometimes favorable conditions under which inhabitants of the Confederacy acquired people. So, if adapting to the war is one major reason, arguably the biggest adaptation Confederates have to make is to the reality of emancipation. So, the second major reason I found Confederates engaging in the slave trade is to fend off the effects of emancipation. Now, we know that during the Civil War, hundreds of thousands of people fled to Union lines or otherwise seized their freedom. This is a map I grabbed from a great project the University of Richmond's Digital Scholarship Lab runs. Each of the red dots represents what they call an emancipation event, someone trying to seize their freedom during the Civil War. This map tells us a couple of things. First and foremost, it tells us there were a lot of these events. And we don't know exactly how many people fled for freedom during the Civil War. The best guess is about 450 to 500,000. That number could be as high as 800,000. But the other thing that this map tells us, I'll tell you, first of all, that means that of the 4 million people enslaved in the United States before the Civil War, at a maximum, one out of every five, at a maximum 20%, actually achieved their freedom during the Civil War. And that number is probably more like 12 to 15%. That number is also concentrated in specific regions. As you can tell from this map, Virginia, the Sea Islands of South Carolina and Georgia, the Mississippi River Valley. And it's strongly correlated to where the Union Army goes. What this means is that Confederates still hold sway over much of their former nation, and that gives slaveholders leverage over the enslaved. That they use the threat of sale to restrain people who might have thought about escaping, and it forces enslaved people to weigh the threat of sale against the prospect of escape. Um, if you try to escape if you try to escape as an enslaved person and you fail, you stand an excellent chance of being captured and sold away from friends and family. A good example, not far from Plymouth, where we were talking about earlier, Charles was the plantation of Charles Pettigrew. He was the member of one of the largest slaveholding families in North Carolina. And during the Civil War, he became afraid that the people he enslaved might run away. This was a reasonable fear. They did, in fact, run away on many occasions. But he thought that there was a chance of a mass escape, and he concocted a plan. His plan was to, as he put it, and this is a quote, sell the ringleaders as a means of intimidating others into not fleeing. So the slaveholders often threatened to preemptively sell people. As I said, when enslaved people actually did run away, they were regularly, frequently captured and resold. In King George County, for example, Confederate soldiers found a man named Moses standing in the Potomac River trying to signal to a Union gunboat. They captured him, and his enslavers soon sold him via Richmond. We've already talked about the example of Candace, but what Candace reflects is another reality. When enslaved people when Confederates recapture enslaved people, especially people like Candace who had been in Union lines, they're often worried about what effect that might have on the people they still hold captive. And so it's almost like people who have been in Union lines. Confederates see them as having a contagious disease, what people from the Revolutionary era called the contagion of liberty, for example. So people who have been in Union hands frequently experience sale because Confederates are afraid of what effect they'll have. A Charlottesville enslaver called it a moral effect. He was afraid that essentially one person who had fled and been recaptured would return and contaminate the others. And so he sold him, a man named Henry, also through Richmond. And as Candace's experience further shows, I love this picture, I should say. What you get here is you see how closely enslaved people are often to Union soldiers. This is near Yorktown in Virginia. The building is supposedly Lafayette's headquarters from the American Revolution. But what you see is the close proximity of enslaved people and Union soldiers. And Confederates were afraid they would bring something back from this and encourage others to escape. Another thing Candace's experience shows us, though, is that even enslaved people who have made it to Union lines aren't safe. The most famous example of this is the Gettysburg Campaign. During the Gettysburg Campaign, Confederate cavalry and excuse me, civilians traveling with the Army of Northern Virginia capture and send into slavery hundreds, perhaps as many as 1,000 African Americans living in Maryland and Pennsylvania. The same thing happens. This is the biggest example that we know of, or at least it's the most famous. There are raids in the Mississippi River Valley that certainly rival this. You get reports of Confederate cavalry carrying off hundreds or even 1,000 people at a time in Mississippi and Arkansas. But this happens wherever Confederate forces cross into Union territory. Harper's Ferry in 1862, raids into Maryland and Pennsylvania in 1864, the Perryville campaign in 1862. Certainly, that last example, when Confederates cross into Kentucky, I know of at least one slave trader who's following with them, looking to acquire people. Um, Another group, if we're talking about repressing emancipation, another group particularly exposed to sale are African American soldiers, people who in many cases had escaped slavery and had joined the Union Army to fight against the institution. Their existence is a rebuke to the Confederate project. And as a result, when Black soldiers fall into Confederate hands, one of many possible outcomes is for Confederates to sell them. To not Confederates often, or at least officially, refuse to treat them as prisoners of war, though many Black soldiers do end up in Confederate prisons. And one way of avoiding this is for Confederates to simply extract African American soldiers from the POW process and to sell them into what Confederates considered, but what was not always renewed bondage. So the slave trade thus provides Confederates with a means of fighting against emancipation. It's a threat to those who are considering running away and a way of making an example of people who have tried and failed in order to deter others. Now, I will say that sometimes this backfires. If enslaved people expect to be sold, they also become more likely to run away. And a good example is the man on the screen here. His name is William Andrew Jackson. William Andrew Jackson had been enslaved near Richmond, and according to his own story, he had been enslaved during the Civil War by Jefferson Davis. He'd been rented by a Richmond slaveholder to Jefferson Davis, and he served as Davis's coachman. In the spring of 1862, though, the person who enslaved Jackson died, which left him exposed to like a court mandated sale as that man's heirs divided up his estate. Jackson caught wind of this. He thought he was probably going to be sold, and he and his wife, after a long and sort of really sad discussion, decided that the best option was for him to run away, which he did. And a week after fleeing Richmond, he showed up in Union lines near Fredericksburg, much like the people on the left of the screen. We could go on and on about this, but in short, slaveholders find the slave trade a really useful weapon against the mounting threat of emancipation. It's a really powerful way of counteracting enslaved people's mobility and the prospects that the Civil War opens up for them. And as a result, the slave trade heads off liberty we cannot even begin to estimate how many people were cut off from liberty during the war by the survival of the slave trade. The third thing I want to suggest is that Confederates and I'm a little embarrassed at how long it kind of took me to figure this out in doing this research. But the Confederates buy people during the Civil War for a pretty simple reason. And that reason is that they think they're going to win the war. This is obvious, but it's hard for us, I think, sometimes sitting here in 2025, 160 years after Appomattox, to get our heads around. The fact that Confederates think they're going to win shapes slave trading in two ways. One, because they think that slavery is in the long term relatively safe, it makes enslaved people a tempting investment in times of economic instability. At a moment when all assets are relatively toxic, to use a modern phrase, enslaved people look less bad than others. Uh, Adding to this, though, there's a large subset of Confederates who think that not only is slavery going to be safe, in the post-Civil War world, but that enslaved people are going to be even more valuable than they ever had been before. And so there's a large subset of Confederates who speculate to a significant degree in enslaved people. I'm going to talk briefly about enslaved people as an investment. This graph, which is a little bit cut off, depicts the line that says New Orleans there is the price of enslaved people in New Orleans in the decades leading up to the Civil War. What the graph shows is that enslaved people had risen constantly in value for about 15 years prior to the Civil War. They outpaced even the cotton economy with which they were so often tied, which means that the Confederates think this is going to continue to happen, especially if they win. And so, if you're in a world where there's 10% inflation per month, ultimately the Confederacy will experience 7,000% inflation during the Civil War. If you're looking for a place to put money, enslaved people are a really tempting option. Enslaved people are more portable than land or cotton. There's not that much gold in the Confederacy in which people could invest. And so, as Confederate money depreciates, many people funnel it into enslaved people. You don't have to be all that enthusiastic a Confederate to do this. As a future governor of Mississippi would write during the war, bad property as Negroes may be, they are still better than the money. Um, uh, a Confederate family in Wythe County wrote one member wrote to the other, though I was glad to hear that you had funded your Confederate scrip in enslaved property. Enslaved people are a more appealing investment, particularly than Confederate money, but also than many of the other options. Now, this really only makes sense, as I said, if you think the Confederacy isn't going to lose. The language of Confederates and the people they target for purchase suggests to me that at least a large subset of Confederates really believe they're going to win for the entirety of the war. As one Virginian put it regularly in letters to his father-in-law, he was, quote, sure the Confederacy would succeed. And if that was the case, which he believed it was, the only real option, and certainly the best possible option, was to put money in enslaved people, who he thought would be worth $2,000, $3,000, even $4,000 or $5,000, multiple times what they had been worth before the war. Even as late as 1865, with Sherman advancing through his home state, a South Carolinian argued that his family should acquire an enslaved person. Even if we don't succeed, the money won't be worth anything, he suggested. And if we do, slaves will be worth 1,000 times more than they are now. The speculative attitude was reinforced when Confederates targeted women and children. Uh, in sort of raw economic terms, children, especially and to a lesser degree enslaved women, aren't worth that much during the Civil War, especially if you think emancipation is likely. Enslaved children particularly cost more to feed and clothe and care for than they produce in labor on slaveholding entities. And the same is true, but to a much lesser degree for enslaved women. This investment makes a lot more sense, though, if you think slavery is going to survive for decades after the war, because not only will slaveholders then own those children's labor for years, possibly decades to come, but in the case of enslaved women, they will own any children those women might have. As one Virginian put it, therefore, if this war is ever ended fairly, women and children are the property to put money in. A Louisianian, meanwhile, tried to sell a woman who seems couldn't have children, and instead bought two women whom he hoped would, quote, in all probability increase before many years, a timeline that extended beyond the war's likely horizon. So this we can talk more about this in the questions if you would like. But what I think this suggests is the deep confidence that Confederates have in the future of slavery, and the slave market therefore allows them to perform their fate in their overall project. Now we know sitting in 2025 that they failed, but that shouldn't lead us to discount the human cost of this project. This is a slave trading facility in Alexandria, which has an interesting history during the war that we could talk about. But we know that we know that the costs of the wartime slave trade were significant during the war. A good example is the case of a woman named Tula Butler from Norfolk, who posted this in an African American or placed this in in a Norfolk newspaper after the war, seeking information of her daughter Hannah Butler, whom Dickinson Hill and Company had sold during the Civil War. I have no evidence that Tula Butler ever found her daughter. There are thousands of advertisements like this. Sometimes they were successful, sometimes they weren't. An even more extreme case. Let me jump back here for a second. Any more extreme case is that of Richard Johnson, and I found this one of the most powerful things I encountered in doing my research. Richard Johnson was from Maryland. He was a member of the 7th United States Colored Troops, and he had been lost before Richmond, fighting in the fall of 1864. For decades, his family assumed that he was dead. In fact, his mother even filed for a pension to claim what the government was offering for people who had been dependent on soldiers. Turns out he was not dead. He'd been captured, given over to Dickinson Hill and Company, who sold him to Greensboro, North Carolina. And in the decades after the Civil War, he continued to move south, following work until ultimately he ended up in Louisiana. His family only realizes he's not dead in the early 1900s when Richard Johnson applies for a pension, the same pension his mother had been claiming decades earlier. The United States government is highly attuned to pension fraud. Pensions are the leading expenditure of the government in this period, and so investigators ultimately connected these the efforts of investigators to really deny a pension ultimately ended up connecting these two lost wings of a family that had been separated for more than 40 years by the wartime slave trade. So when we talk, I want to conclude here because I want to make sure we have time for your questions. I've seen them coming in. I want to say that, I just would say that one of the things I thought a lot about in writing this book is when we talk about the Civil War, we talk a lot about freedom, and well, we should. The Civil War is a monumental accomplishment in destroying slavery and liberating 4 million people in the United States. But as we think about that accomplishment, we also should be aware of its cost because I think that casts it into even starker relief. Um, the domestic slave trade severely limited the ability of people to pursue freedom. And when they ultimately attained it, people like Richard Johnson, like Tula Butler, found themselves entering it not fully whole, thanks to the effect of the wartime slave trade. So I'll leave things there. I want to make sure like I said, I want to make sure I'm looking for your questions. So I'll leave it off there, and I'm look forward to hearing what else I can say. So thank you so much for being here this afternoon, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Robert. If you have any other questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat, but we do have a few already. During the war, did enslavers have the option not to lease their enslaved people to the Confederate government if the government came to them requesting the use of their labor? Records show some owners paid for slave services.
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's one of those things that this is a really tangled story. Um, and it depends sort of on where you are and when we're talking about. Early in the war, slaveholders are pretty resistant to the government requisitioning, they called it, enslaved people. Essentially, the government would say we need X number of enslaved people from whatever county they happen to be in to go and do work for on the public defenses. Slaveholders often their reaction is often, didn't we go to war to prevent the government from interfering with the institution of slavery? And so there's a really complicated dance between the Confederate government and Confederate state governments and individual enslavers. How exactly resistant they are is kind of hard to say. Certainly, there are slaveholders who are pretty gung ho about this. Uh, Often it is difficult to say no. I will say in one case, I found an example of an enslaver from Lynchburg who said, essentially, he wrote to the Confederate Secretary of War and said, I'm so sick of the Confederate government requisitioning the people I enslaved that if you ask again, I'm just going to sell them all so I don't have to deal with this. So it's a really complicated interaction between individuals and the state government and the Confederate government.
Since Maryland and Kentucky were slaveholding states, aren't the slave traders potentially stealing property not escaped enslaved people?
Yes, absolutely. And this is one of the Confederates. If we're talking about the Gettysburg campaign, and I hope I'm understanding the question correctly, if we're talking about, for example, what takes place during the Gettysburg campaign, from the Confederates argued that there essentially weren't any free black people in Maryland or Pennsylvania, and that all the free black people who were there had at one point been fugitives from slavery in Virginia, and that's sort of their underlying logic. There are numerous cases where it is. It's very, at a minimum, it is unclear that this is the case, and sometimes it's fairly obvious that the people captured on these campaigns were had been free for decades, if not more. If the question is, are Confederates taking people from individual slaveholders in those states? Yeah, that also happens, for sure. And One of the interesting things about the Civil War is that the Confederate Army is sort of both the best friend of slaveholders and a really difficult presence. The Confederate Army is basically the largest city in the let's take the Army of Northern Virginia. Whenever the Army of Northern Virginia camps, especially after the fall of New Orleans, it's basically the largest city in the Confederacy, which means that it is a great place for fugitives from slavery to essentially go and hide. The Confederate, and that's a strange thing to think about, but the Confederate Army has an enormous demand for labor, whether that's driving wagons, cooking, cleaning for soldiers, building roads, things like that. And they aren't terribly picky about where they get that labor from. And so, if you look at fugitive slave ads in Richmond, for example, you will find a huge number that say that the person in question may have gone off with the army or was last seen in the company of soldiers. For fugitives, meanwhile, that means that often going with the army is a way of getting closer to Union lines. So it's a really complicated question, and the relationship between the Confederate military's actions and individual slaveholders is a pretty fraught one during the Civil War.
Well, were you able to document the continuation of the fancy trade during this period, enslaved women and girls being purchased for brothels?
Um, I'm not thinking of any explicit examples of that I came across. Part of that might be because New Orleans is sort of most infamous for this. And New Orleans' slave trade evaporates basically as soon as the Union Army occupies it in May of 1862, so about a year into the war. That said, I would be shocked if it didn't continue in some way, shape, or form. That is to say, the fancy trade was the acquirement, or what was essentially white Southerners acquiring mixed race women for sexual purposes. I'm sure that happened. I have found limited, I haven't seen many examples of it, but I would be staggered if it didn't happen.
Would leasing an enslaved person to the CSA allow a person to keep a son from having to serve if the enslaver was over 35?
No, it would not. Someone would have a white person in the Confederacy would have to take someone's place in the military to get them out of the military. Leasing someone to the Confederate government is a way of making money during the war, functionally. Sometimes the hiring rates would be higher than the return a person could produce through agricultural labor. In many other cases, the people rented by Confederate governments in a place like Tredegar or the arsenal in Fayetteville or various factories in Georgia and Alabama. Many of the people leased in those places are refugees from the coast, and so if you're let's say you're a slaveholder in Tidewater, Virginia, you don't feel comfortable remaining in your home. You would like to take the people you enslave to quote unquote safety in the Virginia interior. If you don't have land on which to work them, that's going to be pretty costly because you have to feed and clothe and provide for those people. Renting them out is a common way of alleviating that challenge.
It looks like Montgomery becomes the major Deep South market, replacing New Orleans during the war. Is this so?
Um, I would say more Atlanta than Montgomery, honestly. Certainly Montgomery has a pretty robust slave trade. I think Verena Davis, Jefferson Davis's wife, buys someone in Montgomery during the war. But the market that really booms during the war is Atlanta. Atlanta had really grown during the 1850s and was a major manufacturing and transportation hub for the Confederacy. And as a result, it continues to boom during the Civil War, which means that kind of like we were just talking about, it's a major place where people send in slave laborers, and its slave market correspondingly explodes.
How did Southerners have the liquidity to engage in this wartime trade as the value of currency is rapidly degrading?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say for a couple of things happen. One is that inflation really kicks in. I mean, you see inflation reflected in the prices offered for enslaved people. If I were to go back, you would see that the Flies got $4,500 for Camp or for Candace. That's probably at least four times, maybe five, what they could have sold her for before the Civil War. So you see inflation, inflation reflected in the prices offered for enslaved people. You also see contracts where essentially, I didn't see a lot of these, but I think it's probably instructive. I saw an occasional contracts that essentially say, one slaveholder will sell another a person and will figure out the price after the war when things stabilize. In other cases, you see enslaved people exchanged for goods, for food, for real estate, and so I don't want to I don't want to just sort of move past this. Certainly, the lack of liquidity really puts a damper on the slave market, especially beginning in the spring of 1864. But prior to that, Confederates are kind of able to whistle past the graveyard or find ways around it.
Okay, and this will be our last question. Why would selling Charlotte affect a man's draft status?
Well, it wouldn't. He's not strictly speaking selling her. He's more trading her. A good way of thinking about it is to find a substitute for service in the Confederate Army. In the times when white Southerners would take Confederate money, it would cost one person several $100s. Was kind of, the going rate for a substitute would be anywhere from like 300 to $1,000. When you get to the point where people don't trust money, enslaved people become a stand-in for that currency. And so this isn't so much a transaction as, one slaveholder says, if you take my place in the Confederate Army, I will give you an enslaved person.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Robert, for joining us this afternoon.